All right, good evening, everyone. We are continuing our study. The syllabus is a little bit different. It had us going through 18, but I kind of worked it out, a little deal with Dwayne that I wouldn't have to go through 3 chapters tonight, but only 2. A lot harder to do that on a Wednesday night. So we'll just do chapters 16 and 17, though we will add the last bit of 15 in because we didn't get to it on Sunday. But the Israelites, they have been on a tremendous spiritual high. They've been rescued from slavery, and they've sung this beautiful song of praise to God for His power, for His loving kindness. But as is so often the case, spiritual highs don't last forever. And now they're going to be confronted with the realities, the harsh realities of life in the wilderness, and they are not going to handle it well. So before we get there, let's go to God in prayer. Father in heaven, we praise your name. We thank you so much for our deliverance from slavery to sin. We pray, Father, that we will be people that look to you and praise you every chance we get, that we would avoid negativity and complaining about our lot in life, Lord, but that we would be faithful to you and recognize that any hardship we face is a natural part of this sin-cursed world that we made unnatural with our sin, Father, but we know also that you have a plan to use whatever suffering and hardship we face to strengthen us, to draw us closer to you, and to help fill us with hope of the day when there will be no more suffering. We'll be through the wandering in the wilderness, and we'll be at home with you. Bless us as we study this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, now we come to the bitter waters of Marah. Again, our understanding of the exact route of the Exodus is hard to reconstruct, but here's basically the wilderness of Shur, and they're going to go down the eastern side of the Gulf of Suez. Verse 22 says, Moses of chapter 15, Moses led Israel from the Red Sea. They went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now, the wilderness of Shur was a very dry desert area, probably would have looked something like this. Okay, so really not a good situation, though you could find water along the way. It's just sometimes you could go long stretches without finding any water. Now, gratefully, God was at least protecting them with a pillar of cloud during the day for shade. Otherwise, they probably would have just been scorched to death by the sun. But even despite God's protection of shade, 3 days without water, that's a long time. I mean, that's pushing right up against the human limit of how long we can go without water before we actually die. So again, God is kind of leading them into a trap. It seems like another death trap, right? Just like the trap against the Red Sea, stuck between the sea and the Egyptians. Now, he's putting him in this position to be threatened with dying of thirst. And parents, you can imagine how much your kids would have been complaining on this road trip, how thirsty they are, and when are we going to get there? Are we there yet? And genuinely, I think the parents, they would have been afraid for their own safety, for the safety of their kids. And they finally find water, and they're just overjoyed, I'm sure, and they're just relieved, but then all their hopes are dashed because the water is too bitter to drink. Apparently, sometimes dissolved mineral salts in the water could make it so bitter it wouldn't quench your thirst at all. It would just make it worse. And so naturally they complained to Moses, what in the world are we supposed to drink? What are we supposed to do here? And God, in His gracious provision, has Moses throw a tree into the water, and the waters became sweet. Just like God tested them with the trap between the Egyptians and the Red Sea, so He's testing them here as well to see if they will trust Him. And I also wonder if God's trying to show them that you are my people, and I won't treat you like the Egyptians treated you. And I won't treat you like I treated the Egyptians either. I say that because, number one, back in Exodus 1 and verse 14, it says that the Egyptians made Israel's life bitter with hard labor. God does allow them to suffer from bitterness on some level, but it's not out of evil motives like it was for Pharaoh. No, it's to teach them trust in Him. And ultimately, God rescues them from the bitterness here, just like He rescued them from the bitterness in Egypt. And also, even though they're suffering, God treats them the opposite way that He treats the Egyptians. Because for the Egyptians, He made their water bitter with blood, turning it to blood. And then here, He takes the Israelite water, turns it from bitter to sweet. He's trying, I think, to introduce them to the blessings of the covenant that He's going to make with them at Sinai. As long as they're faithful to His covenant, He'll never treat them like Pharaoh did. He'll never treat them like He treated Pharaoh by sending plagues on them. He actually says this in verse 26. In 27, he said, if you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you, which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. Then they came to Elam, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 date palms, and they camped there beside the waters. This is so often what God does for us. On our way through the scorching desert of life, he not only provides shade for us along the way, but he brings us to places of refreshment and rest and sustenance, which I think, this beautiful oasis here would be kind of a foreshadowing of the land flowing with milk and honey that they're heading toward in Canaan. And I think ultimately the foreshadowing of the garden-like oasis of heaven, where we're ultimately headed with him. Okay, chapter 16, the Israelites are now complaining about food. And I'll get to a question for you guys in a second. Verses 1 through 3, then they set out from Elam, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elam and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after their departure from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the sons of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out in this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. So we can only go for 3 days without water, and God brought them to the limit there as a test, to the brink of their limitations. But we can also only go like 3 weeks or a month without food. And now God is pushing them to the limit again, because this has been about a month since they've left Egypt, and there's no food. And from a human perspective, it's just totally understandable why the Israelites would be complaining here. Even going a day without food can turn you into a Snickers diva, right? But they've gone a month without food. They're freaking out, right? Especially if you start to kind of see visible signs of hunger setting in. People start losing weight in an unhealthy way. You start to see ribs sticking out, right? This is going to be pretty concerning here. And all they can think of is the food that they had back in Egypt. And now they're turning on Moses and Aaron. And it's like, yeah, they probably did have a lot of food in Egypt, but it's because the Egyptians were trying to keep them strong so that they could be slaves and that they could be productive. And now they're accusing Moses and Aaron of bringing them out to Egypt to die. They're actually wishing for death here. We wish we would have just died back in Egypt. So if you put all the complaints together so far, they complained back in Exodus 14 when they were trapped by the sea, and they said, you should have just left us in Egypt. Then they complain in chapter 15 about the bitter water and said, what in the world are we supposed to drink? Here, we wish we would have died in Egypt. Maybe the idea is we wish we would have just died in the plagues. At least it would have been a quick death or something, rather than just suffering hunger and starvation for a month until we die out here. And then if you jump ahead to chapter 17, they're going to complain again about a lack of water and questioning this time whether God is even still with them or not. So look in chapter 17, verses 3 and 7, the people thirsted there for water, and they grumbled against Moses and said, why now have you brought us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? And then verse 7, he named the place Mesa and Meribah because of the quarrel of the sons of Israel and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? All right, so here is the first question. What can we learn about complaining, why we tend to complain, why it's so bad in these chapters? Raise your hand, we'll get you a mic. Sterling, start us off.
Hello?
There it is. Yep.
Well, complaining makes us ungrateful for the things that God bless us with. Takes your mind off of what he's done for you, and then all you think about is whatever you want else, like whatever you want more.
Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah. That's a great point. I mean, their minds are certainly not on the fact that God just rescued them from slavery in Egypt. They're thinking only about the negatives and not about the blessings that God gave them. All right, Anna, and then Joy.
First thing I wrote was nothing good comes from it.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's not really accomplishing anything, right? Except making their attitude worse over time. Joy?
Well, we should learn not to accuse God when we find ourselves in difficult circumstances and to trust that he'll keep his word.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of questioning God's motives here. And that's the thing, God is actually leading them with this pillar of cloud and fire. So it's not that they don't believe that God exists. They're questioning whether God is good or not. which is also Satan's favorite thing to get us to question, right? Is he actually going to take care of us? We know he exists. He's right there. He's in the cloud. We see him. But what is he doing? Does he even care about us? All right, what else? Will? Okay, Phil and then Will. Rhymes, easy to remember. All right, go ahead, Phil.
Back in 1 Corinthians 10, when he talked about their example, their bad example of their lust for evil things, what I think he's trying to do is when we confront God and encounter him the way they did, our life changes. It's no longer about what we think or what we like or what we want. The evil things that they craved were the food from Egypt. Those aren't evil in themselves. What he's really saying is the evil is that they did not desire God. They desired his provisions, but they didn't really desire God. And so in this relationship, God is trying to establish with them by taking them through the Red Sea and saving them from their sins and then bringing them to the wilderness. He's detaching them from all of the things that they are physically and bodily attached to. And as that begins to unravel here, and he forces them to deal with those attachments, and his answer was, if I deprive you this long enough, we'll be able to kill that desire and hopefully replace that desire for him. So their biggest problem was they didn't desire him.
Yeah, that's a great point. That a lot of times we complain because our priorities are off. We're wanting the wrong things. We're looking for the gifts and not for the gift giver. Yeah, Will?
And this is just like problem and solution idea in my mind when I get to it. What I've found is that we complain when at least I do. I don't know if anyone else does this, but I tend to complain whenever I don't have all the answers and I just don't understand why something is happening. Maybe instead of why are you on our side or not, they could have said something along the lines of, why is this happening? I want to know why I'm going through this. And I'd assume he would take, I don't fully know this, but I feel like God would take that so much better than them accusing them and consistently demanding what they were so used to in Egypt.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll get to that question in a second about how they could have handled it differently. But yeah, I mean, I think we complain when the future is unknown. I think another way to say that is when we're afraid, right? It's easier to complain than it is to confront our fears and our doubts about God. And sometimes we just avoid talking to God about it because we're so afraid instead of just, doing that, bring it to him. Randy?
Yeah, that's very true. What I'm trying to learn is that we have it so good in this country.
Here, Randy, can you hold it just more direct? There you go. Sorry, it just doesn't pick up sometimes. Oh, did it turn off?
We got a green light now.
All right, very good.
Yeah, what I'm trying to learn is that we have it so good in this country, and it's kind of like the cruise control in your car. We tend to set it at where we are right now, which is way above anything we should really, of course, we don't deserve anything, but way above what we should expect to have. And occasionally the traffic in front of us slows down, and then we get all upset. But it's really, we're way above where we would have been anyway. And when it slows down, we're getting closer to where we probably should be, in a sense. And I'm trying to learn to not set those expectations according to how the real good times are.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, once you reach a certain comfort level, it's hard to go back down. And when they go back down, you get upset and like you're entitled to that higher comfort level, and then you start complaining. Yeah, Bonnie? And then who else had? Oh, I'm sorry, Megan, then Bonnie. Go ahead.
I also think God will provide our needs if we ask correctly and respond appropriately. And I can't help but think of Paul that said he was thankful no matter what his situation was. And that's something we should learn to do.
Yeah, really good. Megan?
Well, kind of similar to Bonnie, I think none of this is by accident on God's part. And he's trying to evoke a certain response and they're not getting the picture, and a lot of times we don't either.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, definitely. And appreciating that we might be in this situation because God's trying to use it, to grow us will be helpful to avoid complaining. Let's see, a couple things I had here too. When we complain, we tend to exaggerate and make things sound 10,000 times worse than they are. Wish we were dead. We'd be better off dead than being out here. It's like, well, okay, maybe. I mean, it's bad. If I was in their situation, right, like I hadn't eaten for a month, I'd be going crazy too. So I'm trying not to be too hard on them. But we do kind of sometimes make things sound a lot worse. When we complain, let's see. Oh yeah, sometimes we complain because we're pining for the good old days, and we forget that actually in the good old days had problems too. Right? They might have been different kind of problems, okay, but every generation, every decade of our life has problems of its own, and Solomon actually says it's just not wise in Ecclesiastes to look back and say, oh, weren't the former days so much better than these? That's not really going to lead you down a good road. Let's see. Let me also say this. Complaining stems from a lack of faith. I mean, the Hebrew writer warns us in chapter 3 that we need to be careful not to have evil, unbelieving hearts like the Israelites who tested God in the wilderness. And that's the other thing they did with their complaint, and especially in chapter 17, they're testing God. They're asking God to jump through their hoops. And if God doesn't jump through their hoops, well then, they're not going to be happy. Okay. But God ultimately, like Megan suggested, is trying to shape and mold them into people who have complete faith, not just in His power to provide, but in His willingness to provide. And that's going to actually make them much more ready to join Him in covenant at Sinai. Okay? But they're too short-sighted. They can't see how God is working on them, and so they complain. And here's what's amazing. God provides anyway. Okay? The irony is they're acting with just as much unbelief as Pharaoh here. They don't believe God's going to take care of them. But when Pharaoh didn't believe, God said, okay, I'll prove to you that I'll take care of my people by sending plagues on you. When the Israelites don't believe, God says, okay, I'll prove to you who I am, not by sending plagues, but by sending blessings on you. And it's just an incredible display of God's mercy and patience here on His part. He says in verse 12, back in chapter 16, I have heard the grumblings of the sons of Israel speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. There's that phrase, right? Knowing Yahweh. One way you know it's Yahweh is when you see His judgment raining down on horribly wicked sinners, okay? But the other way you know it's Yahweh is when you see His blessings raining down on horribly wicked sinners. Both sides, His justice and His mercy, are displays of His character and who He is in His glory. And interestingly, in verse 28 of that chapter, the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? That's very similar to what He asked Pharaoh. Back in chapter 10 and verse 3, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? So again, Israel's acting like Pharaoh, yet God continues to be patient with them. Not just withholding punishment, but also showering them with blessings. And isn't it usually the case that even in the times we are grumbling and complaining, God is still blessing us in ways that we may not even notice because we're too busy looking at all the stuff we don't have or the stuff that's not going right, that we miss all the amazing things God is allowing to go right that we don't deserve. All right, well, here's a question. And Will started us down this path a little bit already. Psalm 55:17 says it's okay to complain to God. The psalmist says, I'm going to complain to you actually, morning, noon, and night. How could the Israelites have complained in a way that was more appropriate and God honoring in these chapters? All right, Mary? Because we don't want to give the impression that, you can never say anything negative to God. You can't bring your negative, bad situation to Him. That's certainly not true. Mary?
I think it's, as someone said earlier, they are afraid. They're terrified. If they just told Him that, they're saying, sorry, we know we should have faith, but this is really hard. Mm-hmm. And tell Him their feelings. And I think He would sympathize more than that. I mean, the thing about complaining is it puts the responsibility on someone else, and it takes away from what you're feeling.
That's a good way to say it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be like the man in Jesus' day where he says, I believe, help my unbelief, right? It's like, I believe, I saw what you did in Egypt, but this is a real struggle, and I'm really having a hard time with it, and just bring that to God. Carol, and then Joe. And then I saw another hand up here, too. Go ahead, Carol.
They were not complaining to God. They were complaining to Moses.
Okay, good.
If they had turned to God and talked to him, he would have listened to them and he would have met their needs. But they went through Moses. And the other thing is when you start grumbling, all it takes is one person, and then it lights a fire amongst everybody else. So when we grumble and complain and we don't go to God, but we go to someone else, then that just spreads it around.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great points. I mean, twice, Moses and Aaron, in verses 7 and 8, they say, who are we that you should grumble against us, right? Your complaint's not with us, it's with God. Sterling, Rachel's got one. Next. Yeah, Rachel. So yeah, great thought. Joe?
Well, you sort of talked about what I was thinking about the unbelief, help my unbelief. Start off by thanking God for what he's already done.
Yeah, mingle the complaint with praise.
And then it, then help my faith going forward, God.
Yes.
So start off with the good. I mean, recognize what he's already done.
Absolutely. A lot of the lament songs that you read, they often will say, God, like, you've already delivered me from this other situation, and you've delivered my ancestors from another situation like Egypt. And so, yeah, deliver me now, please, like you did before. Okay? And mingling that with an acknowledgement of all that he's done. Boy, that's so helpful. I mean, that principle is true whenever you have any sort of negative thing to say to anybody, right? But especially with God, acknowledging his grace and mercy. Yep. Megan?
There's just a pretty common, popular phrase that I think fits very well. Seek to understand rather than to be understood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So it's not wrong to ask God, help me understand what you're doing in this situation. Doesn't mean he's going to make it clear to you, but you can definitely ask him that. Absolutely. That's an honest question. Yeah, Joe? Oh, sorry. Somebody else had it first?
Okay. Well, I was just going to quick follow-up. If you take the time to thank God for all he's done, you run out of time. You won't get to your complaints. As another thing. I mean, there was times to complain here. I get that. Yeah. But if you really count your blessings, if you will, that was something that was a thought that came about before the mic.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so the more you magnify the blessings, right, the more the problems get minimized, and it kind of puts things in perspective for you. And I do find it interesting that, like, when they were praising God in Exodus 15, it was just fantastic. But then as soon as the song and the music stopped, then it was like, oh man, where's our, life stinks. So you got to keep the music going, right? You got to keep praising God, and that will help you kind of stay on that spiritual high. And even when you're at your low points, going through difficulties, it'll keep those low points from getting so low that they're overwhelming and cause you to forget the blessings of God. Okay, good. So in verse 13, let me just make this last comment about this too. Express your trust in God, that no matter what bad things happen in this life, A, he can use these things to shape our character and make us more like him and draw us closer to him. Okay? And B, that one day, like, we have a hope that we're going to be in a place where there is no more suffering. There's no more problems or tears or crying. It may not be that God delivers us from the trial, but we can ask him to strengthen us in the trial. Okay. All right, verse 13, he sends them quail for the first night, which was a great way, I think, to just alleviate their extreme hunger, right? Here's a bunch of meat, right? You haven't eaten for a month, just, have at it. But then it seems like that was just a one-time thing. Then the next morning, the manna miraculously appears on the ground. Manna is from a Hebrew word that means, what is it? They just weren't sure what it is. They had never seen bread just kind of like growing on the ground before. But based on the description later in verse 31, it would have been incredibly delicious, okay? Like wafers with honey. Once again, God abundantly provides for them, but even in the blessing, there's a test. Okay, so he gives them careful instructions for how to reap this certain blessing, okay? Number one, they had to collect it in the morning because once the sun came out, it was milked. Two, they had to only collect a half a gallon of it per person. Okay, so if you had multiple people in your tent, well, then you would just multiply half a gallon by however many people were in your tent, and that way everybody would have the same amount. Three, they could not hoard it or store it up for the next day or the next week at all. You had to eat it all that day. Otherwise, it would spoil if you tried to save it for the next day. And then fourthly, you could not go out to collect any of it at all on the seventh day because that was the Sabbath rest. So the sixth day, if you think about it, the sixth day was the only day that you could actually hoard it up for the following day, and it wouldn't go bad. It wouldn't spoil. And of course, Israel failed this test miserably. Verse 20 says, they did not listen to Moses, and some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul, and Moses was angry with them. And then in verse 27 and 28, it came about on the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my instructions? They were not getting the lessons God was trying to teach them here. So let's talk about what some of those lessons were so that we can make sure that we get these lessons ourselves. What lessons can we learn about God's instruction, about the Sabbath day, and the manna collection? All right, Herb's got one.
So there's a number of excuse me. There's a number of firsts in these readings. It's our first mention of 6 days and resting on the seventh. That was not a tradition until now. Mm-hmm. This also, what you're going to get to, is Joshua's mentioned for the first time in this reading. Mm-hmm. So there's a number of things God's bringing into their relationship. And one is, I'm going to give you commands, and if you follow those commands, things will go well. And if you don't follow those commands, it's not going to go well for you. Yeah. And what do I always say about the Old Testament? It's our what? Our tutor?
Our tutor, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like that for them now. They're learning to follow, just like kids. Mm-hmm. Sure. Kids, you can do this or you can do something else and you'll suffer the consequences. So is that kind of what you were looking for?
Absolutely. That's one of the things I have, that God is testing them, and he does the same thing for us, to see if they'll handle the smaller responsibilities first before giving them the bigger responsibilities. He's preparing them to listen to Moses, right? If they can't listen to Moses' manna regulations, how are they going to listen to the law that Moses is going to give them from Sinai about all these other, hundreds of laws or whatever? So this is a test. It's like what Jesus says in Luke 16:10, he who is faithful in a very little thing will also be faithful in much. So this is preparatory for them. Yeah, Will, and then I can't remember who else has it, and then Roy.
Essentially, it's also a test of how much faith you have in him.
Yes.
I would say that yes. Because when you do when you go against the rules he has, it could either show your lack or just complete lack of faith in him.
Absolutely. I mean, this is huge because in an agrarian culture, if you're a farmer, you stored up crops all the time, right? Because you knew you're not going to have crops growing every day of every month of every year. Like, you have to store things up. Otherwise, you're going to be in big trouble. And God's saying, I'm turning that whole system on its head. You're not allowed to store a thing up. You have to completely trust me on a daily basis to take care of you. I think this is what Jesus gets at in his prayer when he says to pray to God, give us this day our daily bread, right? Take care of me today. Okay, that takes huge faith. But there are other things that take faith here as well, building on that. Like, if every time I save up manna, on the next day it's just rotted, well, then how do I know that's not going to happen on the seventh day? Right? Like, I have to somehow trust that that's not going to keep happening on the seventh day. Let's see. Okay, who else? Rory?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it has to be God's way, not man's way. It would in a normal world, it would perfectly make sense that you would collect and save things up for a rainy day or a tough day or whatever.
Yeah.
But it just has to be, the lesson is it has to be God's way. And you can't follow your own instincts or man's way.
Yeah, and that's what later in Deuteronomy, Moses will say, God was trying to teach you that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. In other words, God is your source of real sustenance, not your own labors, not your own ability to work for food and store up, physical bread for yourself. God is the one who is your sustenance. Maybe another thing here is God was teaching them that they didn't really need much in this life. I mean, it was a pretty simple life. You just need your basic daily food and shelter, and you need God, and you need each other, right? That's a pretty simple life there. And maybe one more thing. God knows we need rest, right? So he gives them the Sabbath rest so that they'll take one day a week to enjoy their relationship with him like Adam and Eve had in the garden before sin. All right, God then establishes a memorial. At the last part of this chapter, he has them put the manna in a jar, keep it as a memorial of his provision in the wilderness. Later, this will go inside the Ark of the Covenant. The Israelites will eat manna for 40 years until they arrive at Canaan. And even though the manna was delicious, it's going to get very old for them. It's going to cause problems in the book of Numbers. There's going to be a lot more complaining about, are we still eating this manna? This is driving us insane. Is there nothing else? I've not done this before, but I think honestly, it would be a cool idea to create like a deliverance jar of your own at your home. Maybe take artifacts that remind you of the time that God delivered you from something, put it in that jar, and you can just preserve it and then teach your kids about it, right? And then maybe you can get passed down family to family, and your kids can teach their kids. This pin, right? It reminds me of the time God saved my career. Hey, this picture is from the day God first introduced me to my wife. I was trying to think of an artifact for saving me from headaches, but a skull sounded a little bit morbid, so I'm still kind of working on that. But I think that's just a really neat idea, to just preserve a memorial, collect a collection of things that remind you of God's deliverance over the years that you can pass down from generation to generation. Okay, I think we have some time for this question. What do you think Jesus meant when he said that he was the manna from heaven in John 6? All right, Joy has one, and then Joe has one. Go ahead, Joy.
I think maybe what Jesus meant was that his sacrifice on the cross would save them just as the manna saved the Israelites in the wilderness.
Okay, yeah, definitely. I mean, he's talking about his flesh and blood. In fact, the crowds thought he was talking about cannibalism because he was saying, you need to eat my flesh and drink my blood. So thousands of people just walked away from him and thought he was crazy. But he was really talking about his body and his blood that would be shed, for us on the cross for our eternal life. Yeah, Joe?
Both were God sent, and we couldn't provide for ourselves, or they couldn't provide for themselves, and we can't provide for ourselves. So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it has to be from God, right, to give us that sustenance. Yeah, really good. We're all on a journey through the wilderness to heaven, right? And Jesus is saying, I am your daily sustenance, right? You come to me. Really what he was getting at with the eating his flesh and drinking his blood, of course, Catholicism likes to make that into a Lord's Supper talk, and he's just not talking about that at all. He's talking about belief. All throughout that text, he's saying to believe in me, to imbibe my words, okay? If it's not by bread alone that we survive, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, Jesus is the Word. And when we believe his word and imbibe and take his word in us, that is our sustenance. And in contrast to the manna, which is only temporary and you just get hungry again after you eat it, he says, you eat from me and my words, you'll never hunger again. And you'll never die again, because you'll have eternal life. All right, chapter 17, Israel tests God. They've come now to Rephidim in the wilderness of Sin. Again, not 100% sure where some of these locations are, okay? But there's no water again, so they complain, and this time Moses asks them, why do you test the Lord? Now, they're essentially trying to make God jump through their hoops and say, if you're really with us, God, you'll give us water right now. But how insane is that? God has already proven to be with them so many times, and yet they're still putting him through a test to prove himself that he's really there. And God, it's amazing. I mean, he could have just struck them dead. He doesn't. He plays along in his mercy, and he actually passes their test. He takes their test, and he goes ahead and gives them water. Says, Moses, strike the rock, and they can have water. But even though God is patient and merciful, Moses will later say in Deuteronomy to their children, don't do what your fathers did and test God. Don't do that. And in fact, Jesus, when he's in the wilderness and Satan tries to tempt him, he tries to get him to test God. He says, if God is really with you, jump off the temple and God will send angels to catch you. And Jesus quotes Deuteronomy 6 and says, no, you shall not test the Lord your God. Jesus knew God was with him. God loved him. He didn't need to put God through any sort of test to prove that he was there. And I think that's a good lesson for us because testing God comes from a major lack of faith and a terribly entitled attitude. The Amalekites now ambush Israel. These are Esau's descendants. So we still see the rivalry between Jacob and Esau going on all these centuries later. And this is really the first introduction, Herb mentions this in chapter 17, first introduction to Joshua. And that's probably because their victory here is a foreshadowing of their victory over Canaan under Joshua's leadership later. Joshua goes to get men to fight. Moses lifted up the staff to give them victory from God. Whenever the staff was raised, they would win. Whenever the staff dropped, they would lose. And so Aaron and Hur, they helped Moses, support his hands to keep the hands up. And when they won, God told Moses, write this event down and never forget it. Because one day, I'm coming for the Amalekites for this. They're not getting away with what they did to my people. Now, just something really cool. Normally, armies would raise a banner, right? And they'd have a flag. And it would be their identifying mark, right? It was, this is who we are. And it would also, if they were a ferocious army, strike fear into their enemies. But that flag, it represented who they are, what they're fighting for, what they valued. And Moses says, Yahweh is my banner. He is the flag that identifies us and shows the world who we are, what we're fighting for. Okay, let me just skip this question and go to the last one. Not because it's bad, but just for time's sake. So I have 3.5 minutes. What are some other applications to learn from these chapters? If you want to answer that previous question, you can, about lessons we learned from Amalek's attack on Israel. But I'll just open it up more generally and close out the class this way for the last 3 minutes. All right, David?
Well, I was impressed by one thing that I never saw in any of the chapters is, where's the Thanksgiving? There's no praise. God, want water, here's water. Want fruit, here's manna. Here's some quail, we win you victory. Where's the Thanksgiving that they had after coming through the Red Sea?
Good point, right? They should have been singing, it should have been Exodus 15 all over again every time God gave them something, right? Should have been praising God in song. But they didn't do it. They had like an entitled mentality almost. And when you're entitled, there's no Thanksgiving. There's only complaining when I don't get what I want. All right, Randy's got one up front. There's only complaining when I don't get what I want. And then when I get it, then I'm just, of course I got it. I deserve it. So. All right, Randy?
I was thinking a minute ago, if I went outside and I saw food on the ground and it wasn't covered with ants, I'd know it was miraculous. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And it made me think, we know so much more than the Israelites did. And it's so easy to look back and say, how could they do these things? And maybe I need to learn then to use that, to think about that when I'm approaching someone about the gospel. I know so much more than maybe somebody else who's never been exposed to it or went to a church that didn't teach the Bible. And then also, I also need to know, I need to learn more. They didn't know a lot, but I don't know a lot either. So I always need to learn more too.
Yeah, definitely. Yep, and we're warned a lot to not be like the Israelites. Herb's behind you there, Sterling. There you go. And then Rory.
When I was reading this, a part of me was kind of feeling sorry for them because they just don't seem to get it. And so I think, is there a lesson for us? We can look back at this from, how do you say it, from the 30,000 foot level, and we can say, well, God's there, but we get stuck, we get in our lives, and we start complaining, and so what is it? The lesson. Yeah. What can we learn is help us somehow stop and think, okay, wait, God's in control. I may have messed up, but God's still in control, and he's still waiting. He's still there to help me.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, and I think, too, it would help the wilderness generation know not to repeat the failures of their fathers and to explain why they're in the wilderness in the first place, because it was complaint that got them there, and that's been a pattern all the way since the start, since they came out of Egypt. So don't keep doing what they did. Rory?
Yeah, so it's what we'll see over and over again in the Old Testament, but we humans have very, very short memories. And, that's why, it's so important that, he left for us that weekly observance of the Lord's Supper. Because, we need to be built up every week to overcome really our failings as humans.
Yeah. Yep, really good. All right, thank you guys for all of your good comments, and we'll pick up in chapter 18 on Sunday.